An elderly man, once living a quiet and isolated life, has found a new sense of purpose in the most unexpected companion, his dog. For years he walked through his days in silence, his world shrinking with each passing year. He lived alone in a small house, watching as time seemed to slip away, bringing with it a sense of loneliness that he couldn't escape. But then, everything changed the moment a dog entered his life. It wasn't love at first sight, and it wasn't some grand moment of destiny. At first, the dog was just another part of the scenery, another creature he didn't know how to connect with. But sometimes, it's the quietest moments that spark the loudest changes. Slowly, over time, the man and his dog began to form a bond that neither had expected. This was no ordinary companionship, this was a life-changing connection that brought hope, joy, and a renewed sense of purpose. There were days when the elderly man would simply watch the dog sleep, its soft breathing reminding him that he wasn't entirely alone in the world. And there were other days when the bond grew stronger, their adventures together pushing him to places he never thought he'd go again. His morning walks, once a solitary routine, turned into something to look forward to. Each step with the dog by his side reminded him that there was still beauty in the world, still something to look forward to. But just as things were starting to take a turn for the better, life threw its own curveballs. With his newfound companionship came the realization that not everything was as simple as it seemed. The challenges of caring for a dog, the responsibilities, the worries, it was all new territory for the elderly man. And yet, in the midst of it all, something deeper was at work. The dog had unknowingly sparked a fire within him that couldn't be extinguished. There was a drive, a purpose, a reason to get up every morning. But as he navigates this new chapter, he finds himself facing questions he never expected. Is he truly ready for this responsibility? Can he keep up with the demands of his new life? The journey isn't over, and the road ahead is filled with twists, turns, and moments of doubt. But one thing is clear, the elderly man has found a new chapter in his life. A chapter that's just beginning, filled with the potential for change, growth, and a deeper connection than he ever imagined. So what happens next? Does this newfound bond with his dog lead to a brighter future, or will it all unravel as quickly as it began? Stay tuned to see how the journey unfolds, because there's so much more to discover. The elderly man's life before the dog was one of quiet resignation. He hadn't always been this way, this figure who seemed to exist more than truly live. There had been a time when his days were filled with the laughter of children, the buzz of work, and the hum of daily life. But those days felt like distant memories now, fading with each year that passed. The people he had once called friends had moved away or grown distant, and his family, while still nearby, seemed to have their own lives. No one really checked in, no one really visited. It was the kind of loneliness that crept in quietly, almost without notice, until one day, you realized it had taken over your entire world. When he woke up each morning, it was often to an empty house. His coffee sat untouched in the kitchen, and the breakfast table remained still, as though frozen in time. His routines had become mechanical, his movements purposeful but absent of any real joy. He'd wake up, eat, read the newspaper, take a short walk, and then retreat back into his house, waiting for the day to pass. Then one afternoon, a knock at the door changed everything. The elderly man wasn't expecting anyone. He opened the door cautiously, only to find a small bundle of fur staring back at him. The dog was barely more than a puppy, eyes wide and full of uncertainty. It had wandered into his yard, cold and hungry, looking for a place to rest. At first, the man wasn't sure what to make of it. He had never been particularly fond of dogs, and the thought of caring for one seemed like an overwhelming task. He hadn't had the energy for much else lately. Yet there was something in the dog's eyes that stopped him from turning it away. A quiet desperation, perhaps, or a need for comfort that mirrored his own. Maybe it was the way the dog looked up at him, or maybe it was the silent plea in its gaze, but something inside the man shifted. He had never been the type to turn away a creature in need, so, against his better judgment, he let the dog inside. The first few days were awkward. The man wasn't sure how to care for the animal, and the dog seemed just as unsure of him. There were moments of silence between them, moments where the dog would hide under the man's chair or retreat into a corner. But as the days passed, something began to change. The dog started following the man around, watching him as he went about his routine. It was as if the dog had decided to make him its companion, its source of comfort. The man, in turn, began to soften. He found himself talking to the dog in a way he hadn't spoken to anyone in years, softly, almost as if sharing his thoughts with an old friend. And while the dog couldn't respond with words, it seemed to understand. It would nuzzle against him when he sat down, or lay at his feet, offering a kind of silent support. The man couldn't remember the last time he had felt this way connected, needed, even if only by a small, fur-covered creature. But it wasn't just the companionship that made the bond grow. It was the routine the dog brought into his life. Every morning, the dog would nudge him awake, its tail wagging excitedly, eager for their morning walk. At first, the man resisted. He wasn't used to waking up early, and the thought of braving the cold morning air didn't appeal to him. But the dog's enthusiasm was contagious. Slowly, he found himself stepping outside, his feet crunching in the frost as the dog pulled him along. The walks, once a solitary and uninspiring part of his day, became something he looked forward to. He noticed the small details: how the sun rose over the horizon, how the birds sang in the trees, how the air felt fresh and alive. But with each passing day, the man realized that the dog wasn't the only one who needed this routine. He did too. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose. The dog needed him, depended on him, and in return, it gave him a reason to live outside of his own thoughts. It became clear that this bond was doing more than just filling the space in his house, it was filling the space in his heart. Yet, as much as the dog brought joy, it also brought challenges. The elderly man had never considered what it would be like to care for another living being. He had spent so many years looking after himself, managing his own needs, that the thought of tending to someone else, something else, felt overwhelming at times. The dog needed food, water, exercise, and attention. There were moments when the man felt frustrated, unsure of how to keep up. There were times when he would forget to feed the dog on time, or when the dog would drag him across the yard for a game of fetch, leaving him out of breath and sore. It wasn't all smooth sailing. The man had a difficult time adjusting to the dog's boundless energy. He wasn't as spry as he used to be, and the dog, with its youthful excitement, didn't always understand that. But somehow, they found their rhythm. The dog would sit patiently while the man prepared their meals, and in the evening, they would settle down together, the man resting in his chair with the dog curled at his feet. However, as the days turned into weeks, a new worry began to grow in the man's mind. While he had found a new sense of purpose in caring for the dog, he couldn't ignore the fact that his age was catching up with him. His knees ached more than they used to, and his energy levels weren't what they once were. He began to wonder, how long could he keep up with this responsibility? Would he be able to care for the dog as it grew older and needed more attention? The uncertainty gnawed at him, especially when he thought about the future. What would happen if he could no longer care for the dog? Would the bond they shared break apart? The fear of losing this newfound purpose made him more protective of the dog, more determined to keep it healthy and happy. But deep down, he knew that the future was uncertain. He had seen how quickly life could change, how fast time could slip through your fingers. Then, one afternoon, the dog did something that shook him to his core. They were out on their usual walk, strolling down the familiar path near the woods. The dog had been particularly energetic that day, darting ahead of him, sniffing around with a kind of joyful abandon. But when the man rounded a corner, he found the dog standing still, staring off into the distance with an odd, uneasy look in its eyes. It was as if something had caught its attention, something the man couldn't see. He called to the dog, but it didn't move. Instead, it looked back at him with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. The man approached cautiously, trying to figure out what had spooked the dog. As he got closer, he noticed something unusual: a small, torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. It was old and worn, but it looked oddly familiar. The man's heart began to race. Was it possible? Could it be connected to something from his past? He had no idea how the piece of fabric had ended up there, but a nagging suspicion began to grow in his mind. Something was off, something wasn't right. What was this strange sign, and what did it mean for him and the dog? The unanswered questions lingered, and the man couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. And so, as the dog and the man stood there, gazing into the unknown, the tension thickened. The bond between them had grown stronger, but with it came the weight of uncertainty, of fear, and of mysteries that neither of them could yet understand. Would they find the answers they were searching for? Would the dog's strange behavior hold the key to something deeper? Or was this the first sign of a journey either of them could have prepared for? The man didn't know the answer, but he did know one thing: his life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. And now, with the dog by his side, there was no turning back. But what lay ahead was a question he would have to face. Together, they would walk into the unknown. The fabric caught on the branch kept pulling at the man's thoughts as they continued their walk. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was connected to it, something long buried in his past. His mind spun with questions, but they only brought more confusion. Had he seen that fabric somewhere before? Was it part of something he'd once owned? He couldn't place it, but his gut told him it was important. The dog, now alert but calm, walked by his side, as if the moment of strange stillness had passed. But the tension in the air was thick. He tried to focus on the present, but every step seemed to carry the weight of the past. The simple walks they had shared had suddenly transformed into something more, an exploration of not just his new life with the dog, but of something deeper, something he hadn't even begun to understand. He had no idea how, but he could feel the dog knew it too. It was as if the bond between them had somehow tapped into a greater mystery that neither of them could avoid. The man had spent most of his life trying to escape the past. There were things he hadn't talked about, things that were better left undisturbed. Old wounds, regrets, and moments of fear that had settled deep within him. He never imagined that a simple act of kindness, a stray dog, a lonely afternoon, would dredge all of that up. And yet there it was. The fabric, the dog's strange reaction, the nagging sense of something unfinished. As the weeks went by, the man began to notice more subtle things. The dog seemed more unsettled on certain days, its behavior shifting unexpectedly. There were times when the dog would bark at nothing, its ears pricked up in alarm, looking into the distance with an intensity that was almost human. It wasn't like the dog was sensing danger, it was something else, something darker. And when the man tried to comfort it, there was a palpable unease in the air, a feeling that something was waiting just beyond his grasp. One evening, as he sat in his old armchair, reading, the dog was unusually restless. It paced around the room, its tail low, its body tense. The man watched, concerned but unsure what to do. The dog wasn't acting like itself. It seemed as though something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He reached down, patting the dog's head gently, but it pulled away from him, retreating to the corner of the room. The man frowned. This wasn't the same dog that had curled up beside him just hours before. This was a creature on edge, a creature sensing something he could not see. He couldn't understand it. The dog's behavior was becoming more erratic, more unpredictable. And each time it happened, the man felt the same chill creeping down his spine. He'd tried everything to calm the dog, but nothing seemed to work. The joy they once shared had become overshadowed by an unease neither of them could escape. The next day, the man decided to visit the local animal shelter. He needed answers. Maybe there was something wrong with the dog, maybe it was ill, or it was just adjusting to the new life. He couldn't dismiss the possibility, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper, something connected to the past, that was causing the dog's strange behavior. The shelter was quiet, and the staff seemed friendly enough, though the man couldn't help but feel a bit out of place. He explained the dog's recent behavior to one of the attendants, who listened carefully. After a moment of thought, the woman led him to a small office at back of the building. The room was filled with papers, files, and charts. She pulled out a folder from a shelf and handed it to him. "This is the dog's background," she said. "It came to us a few months ago. We don't know much about its past before that, but we do know it was found wandering the streets, a long way from here." The man flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the details. There was very little information about the dog's early life, just that it had been abandoned and had wandered the streets alone for months. There was a note about dog's behavior, how it had been nervous, skittish, and had trouble trusting people. But nothing that explained the strange moments he had witnessed: the sudden barking, the anxiety, the feeling that the dog was sensing something he couldn't see. He stared at the folder, something gnawing at the back of his mind. This wasn't just a stray dog. There was more to it than that. But what? What was it about this dog that seemed so connected to him, to his own past? He left the shelter with more questions than answers. The dog's strange behavior had only deepened his confusion. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed as if the dog had arrived in his life for a reason, like a missing piece of a puzzle he hadn't even realized he was trying to solve. At home, the dog was still restless. It refused to settle, pacing the rooms as if it were searching for something. The man watched it, helpless, as the dog let out a low growl, its eyes fixed on the corner of the room where the fabric had been caught on the branch weeks before. The man had forgotten about it in the chaos of the days that followed, but now the memory returned, sharp and vivid. Could it be connected? He didn't know, but something in his gut told him it was. The fabric, the dog's strange behavior, the unease that had settled in the house, everything was pointing in the same direction. But where? What was the significance of that torn piece of fabric, and how was it linked to the dog's distress? That night, unable to sleep, the man decided to go outside. The air was cold and crisp, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. He stood by the spot where the fabric had been caught on the branch, now long gone. The memory of it still lingered in the back of his mind, like a ghost he couldn't quite shake. He squatted down, examining the ground beneath him. There was something odd about the spot, something he hadn't noticed before. The earth seemed disturbed, as if it had been moved recently. He brushed aside the leaves, his heart pounding in his chest. And then there it was. A small wooden box, buried just beneath the surface. He felt a chill run through him as he knelt down to uncover it. His hands shook as he brushed away the dirt, revealing the box completely. It was old, worn with time, but there was no mistaking it. The dog had been fixated on this spot for a reason. With trembling hands, the man opened the box. Inside, there were old photographs, letters, and a few small, faded trinkets. But one thing stood out: a pendant, tarnished with age but unmistakable. The man's breath caught in his throat. He had seen that pendant before. He remembered it from years ago, from a time in his life he had desperately tried to forget. The memories flooded back, too many to process all at once. What had this box been doing here? What did it have to do with the dog? And what was the connection between the dog's strange behavior and his own buried past? The man stood there, the pendant cold in his hand, the dog watching him from the doorway. The mystery had deepened, and he had no idea what to do next. The questions that had begun with a simple walk had now unraveled into something much larger, something he couldn't ignore. The dog had brought him here, to this moment, But what was it trying to tell him? And would he have the courage to face the truths that had been buried for so long? The pendant felt heavier in the man's palm than it should have, as if it were carrying the weight of years, decades even. His fingers curled around it instinctively, but it did little to ease the growing sense of unease gnawing at him. He glanced over at the dog, still standing at the doorway, its eyes fixed on him with a mix of concern and something deeper, something unspoken, almost knowing. The dog's posture was different now, tense, like it was waiting for him to make sense of this, to take the next step. He had seen that pendant before, he was certain of it. It had been once his mother's, perhaps, or maybe even his grandmother's. The details were fuzzy, buried in the haze of old memories he had long since buried. But the box, the pendant, the dog, it was too much to dismiss as coincidence. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way he couldn't fully comprehend. The man held the pendant up to the light, examining it, his thoughts racing. The old photograph, yellowed with time, was still lodged in his mind. He could almost picture it now, his childhood home, his family gathered around. But the edges of the memory were slipping away like sand through his fingers. What did it all mean? Why had this box, this piece of his past, appeared now? And why had the dog, who, until recently, seemed like a simple companion, become so deeply entwined in this mystery? His heart thudded in his chest as a thought suddenly struck him. Could the dog be connected to all of this somehow? Was the dog a guide, leading him to confront something he had spent years avoiding? It didn't make sense, but the more he thought about it, the more it felt true. The dog had been acting strangely, almost as if it had sensed something about his past long before he had any idea himself. It was as if the dog knew what was buried in that box, knew what was hidden, waiting to be uncovered. The wind howled through the trees outside, rattling the windows, as if nature itself was urging him forward, urging him to face whatever was coming. The house felt colder now, and the dog's unease was palpable. It paced again, its paws clicking against the wooden floor, as if it could sense the rising tension. The man's breath came quicker, his pulse racing. His mind couldn't seem to settle, spinning with thoughts of the pendant, the box, and the dog. He needed answers. He needed to understand why this was all happening. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward the door, the pendant still clutched tightly in his hand. The dog stopped pacing when he approached, looking up at him as though urging him to hurry. The man opened the door and stepped outside, the night air biting at his skin. The dog followed closely behind, its steps quiet and determined. They walked toward the spot where the box had been unearthed, the place where everything had begun to unravel. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating, as if something was waiting, just out of sight, to make its move. They reached the tree where the box had been buried, and the man crouched down, his heart pounding. He had no idea what he was hoping to find. There was nothing else there, no more buried secrets. The dog sniffed around the area, its tail still, its nose twitching as though it had caught a scent only it could follow. But then the dog froze, its body rigid, its eyes locked on something in the distance. The man's gaze followed the dog's line of sight, and his stomach tightened. Through the shadows of the trees, he thought he saw movement, something or someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching. He squinted, trying to make out the figure, but it was too far, too blurred to identify. Yet, his instinct screamed that something was wrong. That figure was waiting for something. Waiting for him. He stood up quickly, his heart hammering in his chest. The dog's growl pierced the silence, low and warning. Its fur was raised, and its stance was defensive. The man felt his pulse quicken. Whatever was out there, the dog knew it. The question now was, what was he supposed to do about it? The wind seemed to pick up, swirling around him, carrying with it the faintest whispers. The whispers echoed in his mind, like fragments of a forgotten conversation, words half remembered, voices long silenced. His hands shook as he fumbled with the pendant, his mind racing. This was no longer just about the dog, it was about him, his past, and whatever it was that had been lurking in the shadows all this time. The dog barked sharply, snapping him back to reality. The man looked down, and for the first time in weeks, he saw something different in the dog's eyes, something more than just fear. There was a deep understanding in those eyes, an unspoken bond that connected them in a way that went beyond the ordinary. The dog wasn't just protecting him, it was guiding him. It was showing him something, and the man was finally starting to understand. He took a step forward, his hand still holding the pendant. The figure in the woods was now clearer, no longer a vague shape but a man, tall, broad-shouldered, standing completely still. There was something unsettling about the way he stood, as if he were waiting for the right moment to approach, to make his move. The dog growled again, this time louder, more insistent, and the man felt a chill run through him. What did this person want? Why had they been watching? And how did they know to come now, just when everything seemed to be unraveling? His mind raced with possibilities, too many possibilities, too many unanswered questions. The man wanted to move, to confront this person, but his feet felt heavy, his body frozen in place. The tension was unbearable, his breath shallow as he tried to gather the courage to step forward. But the moment was slipping away. The figure moved slightly, just enough for the man to catch a glimpse of something, a symbol, a mark on the man's sleeve. It was the same symbol that had been etched onto the pendant. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. This man, the one standing just beyond the woods, was connected to everything: the pendant, the dog, the buried box. This was no accident. This was no coincidence. But why? Why had he come now, and what did he want? The dog barked again, louder this time, its urgency impossible to ignore. It was as if it knew that this moment, this confrontation, was the turning point. Everything had been leading up to this. The man's heart raced as he stepped closer, the dog by his side, ready for whatever lay ahead. What was this man's story? What was he going to say? Was he an enemy? A friend? Or was he the key to unlocking the final piece of the mystery? Every instinct in the man's body told him to move forward, to face whatever came next. But as he walked toward the figure in the dark, the weight of his past, the questions surrounding the dog, and the fears that had built up over the last few weeks pressed down on him harder than ever. He had to know. He had to find out the truth, even if it meant confronting the darkest parts of himself, and the truth, he now realized, would change everything. As the man stepped closer to the figure in the shadows, his mind buzzed with questions. The dog remained still by his side, its ears perked, its body tense, every muscle coiled, ready to spring into action. The air around them felt thick with anticipation, heavy with the weight of secrets long buried. The figure was close now, and every step the man took seemed to carry him deeper into a web he hadn't realized he was tangled in. The symbol on the man's sleeve, the same one as on the pendant, was burning into his mind. He had to know. Whatever this man wanted, whatever this was about, he had to find out. But as he drew nearer, something strange happened. The dog let out a sharp, sudden bark, louder than before, almost desperate. The man froze. It wasn't the sound of a warning, it was as if the dog was trying to communicate something more urgent, something even darker. The figure in the shadows took another step forward, his face now partially illuminated by the flickering light from the house. The man could finally make out the details. His features were sharp, weathered, and his eyes. His eyes held an intensity that made the hair on the back of the man's neck stand on end. The stranger's gaze flickered briefly to the dog, then back to the man, as if weighing him, considering something. "What do you want?" The words escaped from the man's mouth before he could stop them. His voice was steady, but inside, everything was unraveling. The stranger didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket, pulling out something that made the man's breath catch in his throat. It was another pendant, identical to the one the man had found in the box earlier. But this one was different. The edges of the pendant were scorched, as though it had been burned or caught in some sort of fire. The man's heart raced as the truth hit him. This wasn't just about the dog, or the pendant he held. It was about something much bigger, something he hadn't even considered. The stranger held the pendant up, the light reflecting off it, casting an eerie glow on his face. "You don't remember, do you?" the man asked, his voice low, almost whispering. "You never wanted to remember." The words sent a shiver down the man's spine. The dog growled in response, low and threatening. The man took a cautious step back, confusion and fear washing over him. He didn't understand. He didn't remember what? What was the stranger talking about? "You've been running for a long time," the stranger continued, his voice now colder, more deliberate. "But you can't run forever. You were supposed to forget. We made sure of that." The weight of those words pressed down on the man's chest, suffocating him. He stumbled backward, trying to make sense of it all. He had no memory of this person, no memory of any event where they might have crossed paths. But something in the stranger's tone, the certainty in his eyes, made it clear that this wasn't a random encounter. This was something planned. This man, this stranger, had been waiting for this moment. The question was, why? The man's mind spun with questions, too many questions. "What are you talking about? What do you want from me?" His voice cracked as he spoke, a mix of fear and anger creeping in. The dog's growl intensified, the sound almost primal now, like a warning too loud to ignore. The man's heart was pounding, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. He glanced down at the pendant in his hand. Was it just a relic of the past, or something much more significant? He had no answers. Only the weight of the stranger's presence, and the gnawing sense that he was standing on the edge of something that could destroy everything he knew. Before he could speak again, the man in the shadows moved quickly, faster than he expected, and suddenly, there was no more distance between them. The dog lunged, barking fiercely, but the stranger didn't flinch. It was as if he had expected this. In one swift motion, he pushed the dog aside with a strength the man hadn't anticipated. The dog yelped, skidding to the ground, momentarily stunned. "Don't worry about your dog," the stranger said with a twisted smile, his eyes never leaving the man. "It's not the dog you need to worry about." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The man's instincts screamed at him to run, to grab the dog and get away, but his feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The stranger took another step forward, and this time, the man didn't move back. He couldn't. Some force kept him rooted to the spot, and it wasn't fear. It was something deeper, like a magnetic pull drawing him toward the truth, toward the unknown. "You think this is just about the dog, don't you?" the stranger said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think it's just a series of strange coincidences. But you're wrong. This is bigger than you, bigger than the dog. It always has been." The man swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of what the stranger was saying, but none of it made sense. He felt like he was drowning, the weight of the man's words sinking him deeper and deeper into a place where the surface was just out of reach. "I didn't come here for the dog," the stranger continued, his voice quieter now, almost coaxing. "I came for you. I came for what you forgot." The words echoed in the man's head, reverberating through his chest. What had he forgotten? What was it that the stranger wanted him to remember? Before he could ask, the stranger reached into his coat once more. The man tensed, expecting another pendant, or some weapon, but what the stranger pulled out was even more unexpected, a small, worn notebook. It looked ancient, its pages yellowed with age, its cover cracked and brittle. The man's stomach turned as he recognized the handwriting on the front. It was his own handwriting. The stranger held it up for him to see. You don't remember this, do you? He asked, a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. You wrote this. You knew the truth once. The man's hand trembled as he reached for the notebook. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His mind was whirling. How could this be possible? He had no memory of writing this book. He had no memory of any of it. But the stranger's words stung, and suddenly, everything began to fall into place. Slivers of forgotten moments, glimpses of faces and places, memories long lost, rising to the surface like a tide. The man's breath caught in his throat. He had known this person. He had known the truth. And somehow, he had erased it all from his mind. The stranger smiled, seeing the man's recognition. But before he could speak again, a loud snap echoed through the night air, a sound of a branch breaking, followed by the unmistakable rush of movement. The dog, still recovering from the stranger's shove, had somehow regained its footing and lunged forward, furiously charging toward the stranger. The man barely had time to react. The dog's sudden rush toward the stranger broke the tension like a crack of thunder in the silence. The man's heart pounded in his chest, and for a split second, he saw everything in slow motion: the dog's body barreling through the air, the stranger's eyes widening in surprise, the man himself frozen, caught between wanting to protect his dog and not knowing what would happen next. Before the dog could make contact, the stranger reached out with startling speed, grabbing the animal by the collar and lifting it off the ground with a strength that seemed impossible. The dog yelped, struggling in the man's grip, but there was no way for it to break free. The stranger held it there for a moment, his eyes locked on the man as if daring him to do something. Enough, the stranger said, his voice hard, his grip unyielding. This isn't about the dog. It never was. The man's breath hitched in his throat. His first instinct was to rush forward, to pull the dog away, but the stranger's gaze held him in place. There was something in his eyes, a depth, an understanding that made the man hesitate. The truth was close now, too close. The notebook, the pendant, the dog, all of it had been leading him to this moment. What do you want from me? The man asked, his voice raw, his hands still clutching the pendant tightly. Why are you doing this? The stranger finally released the dog, letting it drop to the ground with a soft thud. The dog immediately scrambled to its feet, its body low, tail tucked between its legs, but its eyes remained fierce. The man kneeled beside it, pressing a hand to its fur for comfort, even as his mind raced with fear and confusion. You really don't remember, do you? The stranger said, his voice filled with a mixture of pity and frustration. You were never supposed to remember. But it's happening now, and there's no turning back. The man looked up, his eyes searching the stranger's face, trying to make sense of the words, the situation. There was something about this man, something haunting, that made his stomach churn. He didn't want to believe it, didn't want to accept it, but deep down, he knew the stranger's words were true. The man was connected to him, to his past, in a way he couldn't yet comprehend. Who are you? The man finally demanded, his voice firm, desperate for an answer. What do you want with me? The stranger's lips curled into a slight smile, though there was no warmth in it. I'm someone you used to know, someone you erased from your memory. His eyes glinted with a dangerous spark. But you knew me once. You knew the truth. And it's time you remembered. At that moment, the man's mind spun with fragmented images, faces from his past, places he couldn't quite place, feelings of loss, of betrayal. It was like a puzzle he couldn't complete, pieces scattered everywhere, just out of reach. The dog nudged his hand, sensing his distress, and he glanced down at it, then back up at the stranger. Something about this wasn't just about a lost memory, it was something bigger, something that had been hidden from him for years. Tell me the truth, the man said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. I need to know. The stranger nodded slowly, almost as if he were anticipating this moment. He took a step back, his eyes never leaving the man. "You were part of something," he began, "something that was never meant to see the light of day. A family, a legacy, a secret." The words hung heavy in the air, and the man's stomach turned at the thought. "A secret?" he repeated, as if saying it aloud might help him make sense of it. "The pendant you're holding," the stranger continued, his voice low, "was passed down through generations. But it was never just a keepsake. It was a key. A key to something hidden, something you were meant to protect. That is, until you forgot." The man's heart skipped a beat. A key? His mind raced as he remembered the strange feeling he'd had when he first saw the pendant, the feeling that it meant more than he could understand, that it was tied to something far bigger than anything he had known. "Why?" the man asked. "Why did I forget? Why was I kept in the dark about all of this?" The stranger's expression darkened. "Because there were forces at work, forces you didn't understand. You were part of something that was meant to remain buried, forgotten, for the safety of everyone involved." The dog let out a soft whine, as if sensing the rising tension, and the man reached down to scratch its head, trying to calm himself, to absorb the stranger's words. "But I didn't forget," the man said, more to himself than to the stranger. "It's all coming back. Pieces of it." The stranger's gaze softened, just a little. "Yes, but it's not just about your memory. You weren't meant to remember. If you do, everything changes. The truth will come to light, and it could destroy everything, your life, your world." The man took a deep breath, trying to make sense of it all. What was this secret? And why was the stranger, someone he didn't even know, telling him about it now? Why had the dog, this seemingly innocent animal, played such a central role in this mysterious puzzle? He thought about everything he had learned in the last few days: the box, the pendant, the notebook with his own handwriting. The pieces were there, scattered in front of him like fragments of a shattered mirror. He just needed to put them together. "What is the secret?" the man asked, his voice steady, determined. "What is it that I was supposed to protect?" The stranger sighed, as if he had been waiting for this moment. He took another step back, his gaze now distant, almost regretful. "The secret is a bloodline," he said, his voice lower now, as if sharing something forbidden. "A bloodline that holds power that could change the course of history. And you were part of it." The words hit like a lightning bolt. The man's pulse quickened, his mind spinning. A bloodline? Power? What did that mean? How was he involved? Before he could ask more, the stranger held up his hand, signaling for silence. The dog growled again, sensing the rising tension, but the stranger ignored it. "You don't understand yet, but you will," the stranger said, his voice quiet, almost resigned. "You've been running from the truth, but you can't run anymore. You have to face what you were, what you are, and what you must do next." The man's head swam. His heart raced. He wasn't sure what to do with all the information, all the questions that were now overwhelming him. A bloodline, power, a forgotten legacy, it was all too much, too overwhelming to comprehend in the moment. But one thing was clear: his life had changed forever. Whatever had been buried, whatever had been hidden from him, was now coming to the surface. And the dog that had entered his life so suddenly was the key to understanding it all. He looked down at the dog, its eyes calm now, but with something deeper there, something ancient. It had known. The dog had known all along. "I don't know what to do," the man whispered, feeling the weight of the unknown press down on him. "You'll find your way," the stranger said, his voice soft but firm. "It's in your blood. It always has been." The stranger turned and began to walk away, his figure melting into the darkness, leaving the man standing there, heart racing, mind reeling. He looked at the dog, still by his side, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a spark of hope. The journey was just beginning. The answers would come, but the road ahead would be long and uncertain. Whatever lay ahead, the man knew he wasn't alone. The dog had been with him all along, and together, they would face whatever challenges came their way. As he stood there, the wind picking up once more, he realized one thing above all: the truth might be dangerous, but it was also the key to his freedom. And he was ready to unlock it.